Okay, so good morning. Welcome to the HFRC online webinar about diabetes. We allocate an hour. The presentation and talk won't be that long, but we've allowed plenty of time at the end for people to ask any questions. So if you get any questions pop into your head along the way, please just feel free to write them down, and then we can ask them at the end. That just helps us when we cut, and if we put this up on the YouTube, we don't necessarily want all the questions necessarily. So if you've got a bit of paper handy, that would be good. So diabetes is actually the epidemic of the 21st century. It's probably the biggest challenge confronting Australia's health system. I mean, we wouldn't think that at the moment with COVID-19 going on. We think that's the biggest challenge, and that's probably the one right in front of our nose. But if we look at the numbers and the facts about diabetes, then it's much bigger and much greater implications for our health system. Just a few facts. 280 people develop diabetes in Australia or get diagnosed with diabetes in Australia every day. So that's a massive number. That's one person every five minutes. There's about 1.7 million people diagnosed with diabetes, including type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And today we're predominantly talking about type 2 diabetes, but I can answer any questions about type 1. And there's probably 500,000 people that are undiagnosed, so pre-diabetic. And I suspect there's probably a lot of people that are close to pre-diabetic, and I'll talk about what that means in a little bit. And it estimated to cost the health system about $15 billion every year. So it's massive, as well as the cost to individuals. So it's a massive cost to the society. And interesting, diabetes was once considered like a progressive, lifelong condition for which there was no cure. It was all about just managing the symptoms with medications, effectively. Well, not necessarily effectively, but with medications. But recent advances and some changes in thinking around diabetes have shown that it can actually be reversed with the right lifestyle changes. So it can be put into remission, and that's really what we're going to talk a bit about today. Is what are some of those things that we can do. So today we're going to talk about what's diabetes, what's pre-diabetes, what are some of the signs and symptoms, who can get diabetes, and then we're going to talk about what are the lifestyle strategies that can help. I will talk a bit about the medications, just so people are aware of kind of how they work and what they do. But then what can people do to try and either prevent diabetes, reverse their diabetes, or at least reduce their reliance on medications and managing symptoms. So what's diabetes? Well, it's basically a condition where, or the diagnosis or the description of it is a condition where there's sugar in the blood, too much glucose floating around in the blood. And your normal range for blood glucose, if you did a fasting test, would be 3 to 5.4 millimoles. And anything above that is considered either pre-diabetic or diabetic. A HbA1c, which is another test, which is a test of kind of the average blood glucose measures. Normal's kind of 4 to 5.6% is your average glucose levels. Pre-diabetic would be 5.7 to 6.4, and then anything above 6.5%. So it's too much sugar in the blood, and that's how it was first identified. That it was that was found that there was excess blood in the urine, and then they found excess blood floating around in the excess glucose floating around in the blood. Where does the glucose come from? Well, it comes from the foods that we eat. Predominantly carbohydrate type foods are the foods that break down into glucose. And so that'll obviously be one of the key things we'll talk about, is how do we eat best if we're trying to manage our diabetes and try and reverse our diabetes. Insulin's made, and insulin is the hormone that controls that blood glucose level. And that's one of the key things, and that's where some of the research has been tending to look more at insulin as a precursor. Insulin is a master hormone that does a whole heap of things. Insulin is predominantly our energy storage hormone. So it's the hormone that tells the body to store any excess energy away and protect our energy stores. So it also protects our fat stores. And how does type 2 diabetes come about? Well, when we're not making enough insulin, so a type 1 diabetic would be someone whose pancreas has stopped making insulin for whatever reason. And a type 2 diabetic, it's because either their pancreas has stopped making enough insulin or their tissues become resistant to the effects of insulin. And we'll kind of talk a bit about that as we go through. So I'm kind of working two computers here. So pre-diabetes, let's have a look at pre-diabetes. It's interesting. This is a bit, in some ways, I kind of don't know that there is. Personally, is there such a thing as pre-diabetes? By definition, yes, there is. I mean, you're either a diabetic or you're not. It's a bit like saying you're pre-pregnant in some ways. But if you look at the actual definition, pre-diabetes is a condition where the blood glucose level is higher than normal, but still not high enough to be diagnosed with absolute diabetes. Now, that's kind of playing with numbers in some ways. If your blood sugar level is not normal, it's not normal. But you're not at as much risk. I guess it's an early warning sign. As your blood sugar levels start to go up, then you're at risk or you're progressing towards diabetes. So once that happens, you know that you need to be taking action to try and prevent that. And there's some other tests we'll talk about a bit later, which can actually identify even before that, which I think is really important because people want to prevent this from happening, not wait until it happens. Okay, sorry, just having a look. So who can get type 2 diabetes? The answer is everybody. I tell people that, I could turn myself into a type 2 diabetic in about 3 months if I adopted the right lifestyle behaviours, not the right foods, ate the wrong foods, or ate the foods that were going to push my blood sugar levels up. If I ate too much, if I stopped exercising, all those things. So everybody's susceptible to getting type 2 diabetes. Some people are at more risk than others. Men typically are at higher risk of type 2 diabetes than women, partly because women's physiology is designed to store body fat better, whereas men don't store so much and become diabetic before they put on body fat or before they put on as much body fat. What are the other risk factors? If you've got a family history, genetics plays a part in all of those health conditions, our good health and our bad health, and our, the same as tall parents have tall kids. If your parents or grandparents or relatives in the family have had diabetes, the chances are you're genetically prone to that. Ethnicity plays a big part. So the ethnic groups that are higher likelihood or higher risk of getting diabetes, Indigenous populations, so Australian Aboriginals, American Indians, African Americans, Hispanics, so Mexico has a very high rate of diabetes, and Asian populations. So one of the countries with the highest number of diabetes is up in Asia and China. So that's if we think it's a epidemic kind of in Australia, in the Asian countries, and particularly in those developing countries, there's a huge risk coming through their health system. And interestingly, in those countries, particularly up in Asia, you get a lot more people will get diabetes before they get fat. So Australians and Europeans and Americans tend to get fat and then get diabetes, so put on the weight. Whereas in Asia, they tend to get diabetes first and then put on the weight. So weight's not always, and that can happen in Australia as well, but typically you don't see as many overweight Asian people, but they could still be diabetic, and there's a high prevalence. India is the other country where there's massive numbers of diabetes, so all those Asian populations. If you're overweight, increases your risk for diabetes, and particularly if that fat is distributed around the middle, around your waist. So, the fat that we can see on the outside is generally healthy, but it's the fat that stores around the middle, around our viscera, and I'm sure you've seen the ads on TV that show that that's dangerous, and that's true. That increases your risk for diabetes because it can actually get some fat that's stored in the liver and in the pancreas, which influences their function. people with high blood pressure, people with high cholesterol is considered a risk factor. It's probably not the cholesterol, it's probably the triglycerides, which is another measure that is done when you do your blood profile. There's a fair bit of debate about cholesterol at the moment. I could probably spend an hour talking just about that. But high triglycerides within the body is a risk factor, or it comes with diabetes. If you don't exercise, and we'll talk about exercise as a strategy to manage diabetes, if you've got a sedentary lifestyle, that certainly puts you at increased risk. If you're a smoker, you're at increased risk just because smoking means things don't work as well. We don't get the same blood flow to the tissues. Excess alcohol, or too much alcohol, and what's too much depends on the individual. Poor sleep can put you at risk of diabetes. So people who work shift work, FIFO workers are probably at increased risk just because their sleep patterns are disrupted. Low testosterone levels in men. So as men get older, their testosterone levels naturally drop. That increases their risk, predominantly because they lose muscle mass. And diet, depending on the diet that somebody's eating, certainly puts people at more risk. And unfortunately, in Western society, and Australia's included in that, we've got lots of processed foods which aren't good for diabetes. So I guess who can get it? Like I said, everybody, those groups are the ones that are more at risk. What are some of the signs and symptoms of diabetes? One of the first things that, and this is often in type 1 diabetes, they pick up where people are excessively thirsty and hungry. The thirst bit comes because the body's trying to get rid of glucose out of the system, so people go to the toilet more, which is that second sign on there. They're going to the toilet more often because the kidneys are trying to get glucose out of the body and not absorbing it back. The kidneys don't absorb it back in, so you end up going to the toilet more to get rid of the glucose that's in the urine, and with that goes water, obviously. Weight loss or gain. Weight loss is usually when the pancreas has stopped working effectively. Weight gain when pancreas is working too effectively and we're producing lots of insulin. Fatigue and being irritable. We know that diabetes is a major risk factor for any of the organs where small blood vessels go to. So our eyes are particularly susceptible to the effects of diabetes because the blood vessels get damaged by the high glucose and also the high insulin. If you've got wounds that aren't healing, that's a sign that the glucose levels are too high, so possibly pre-diabetic. Skin infections that goes with that, nausea, just not feeling good. Some signs that people don't think about, some darkening areas of the skin, and little skin tags. So people get little tags of skin. That's a sign that they're insulin resistant or diabetic. The other things that can occur for people, they get that odour of acetone on their breath, and some tingling and numbness in the feet and toes. And that's again because the insulin and the high glucose affect the small nerves, and so we get that tingling or numbness, so the nerves stop working as well. Let's have a look at what's been the typical treatment for diabetes. Now, remember, the belief has been for a long time that it's a progressive, lifelong condition. And so the treatment's been about managing symptoms, not acting to try and reverse or change diabetes. So there's a number of different drugs, but typically drugs have been developed over the years to manage the symptoms of diabetes. And there's a number, I'm going to mention a few just in case you're taking one or you know people or you've heard of them. The first type of drug that's commonly used is big adenides. So metformin would be the drug. Things like Diabex, Diaformin, they're the brand names, if you like, and they work to lower the blood glucose levels by reducing the amount of glucose that's stored in the liver from being released into the system and slowing the absorption of glucose in the intestines. So they also help the tissues become more sensitive to the effects of insulin, and that means that the insulin will force the glucose out of the blood and into the tissues. And you'll hear a common theme coming through with these medications, what they're trying to do. They're all trying to lower blood glucose levels. So another type of drug are the sulfonylureas, what might be some of the brand names, Diamicron, Gliade, Ozyglide. So what they do is they stimulate the pancreas to produce more insulin. And so when more insulin is produced, it forces the blood glucose, or it encourages the blood glucose to get out of the blood and into the cells. Insulin works a bit like a key that allows the glucose to get into the cells and out of the bloodstream. Another type of drug is, I'm going to have to pronounce this one, thiazolidinone, sorry, and pronounce that wrong. Thiazolidinones, yeah. Anyway, what do they do? The brand names Avandia or Actos, they lower blood glucose by increasing the effect of your own insulin. So they make the tissues become more sensitive to the effects of insulin that the body is releasing. And they work particularly well on both muscle and fat. So, when they work on the muscle, glucose gets into the muscle, we can use that for energy, and then any excess gets stored away in fat. There's some alpha-glucosidase inhibitors. They help to slow down the digestion and absorption of certain carbohydrates in the stomach. So that means we're basically saying we're trying to keep the glucose and the carbohydrates in the intestine so it passes all the way through and doesn't get absorbed. There's some DPP4 inhibitors, names like alogliptin, unigliptin, thinning of that gliptin on. So Januvia is a common one that I've seen quite a bit. They work to inhibit those enzymes, that DP4 enzymes, so that and they also enhance the levels of incretin hormones, so which act to lower the blood glucose levels by increasing the amount of insulin that's produced from the pancreas. Some incretin mimetics, so Byetta, Victoza, they're kind of artificial incretin hormones, and what they do is they lower blood glucose by stimulating the pancreas to produce more insulin. And there's some new ones, or relatively new ones out, some SGL2 inhibitors, Jardiance, Forxiga, and they block glucose from being reabsorbed in the kidneys. So remember before I said that the constant or frequent urination, because there's more glucose in the urine, well, these drugs actually stop the kidneys from reabsorbing the glucose, so you wee it out when you go to the toilet. And then I guess all of those are to manage the symptoms. I guess the final medication that people can end up on is artificial insulin. So when the pancreas is not producing enough, or the body's not responding to the amount that the pancreas is producing, you can get insulin injections to increase the amount in the body, so that causes the blood glucose to get absorbed by the tissues, provided they're not too insulin resistant. Now, there's a downside to doing the insulin, and that's probably the risks that come with that, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So they're all the drugs, and like I said, they manage the symptoms. They don't control or fix the problem, they just manage the symptoms. And really, what you would have noticed, I think there was a common theme, they were all trying to keep the blood glucose levels down, whether that's by increasing insulin so more gets absorbed out, stopping the absorption of glucose or carbohydrates from the food that we eat. So what are the lifestyle factors that actually do those things? And there's three key ones that I've got on here. The foods that we eat. And we will talk in more detail about this in a sec. But obviously, what we're trying to do is eat foods that don't put excessive glucose into the system. If all the drugs and treatments are designed to keep our blood glucose levels low, why don't we just put less in there? So we'll talk about what are the dietary patterns that help with that. Exercise plays a key part because it helps the sensitivity to the tissues, to the muscle tissues in particular, to the effects of insulin. And in fact, exercise kind of does the job of insulin by allowing the blood glucose to get in. And I've got sleep on there. This guy's not sleeping too well, but we know that when people's sleep is disrupted or they're not in a good sleeping pattern, then their insulin sensitivity, so the body's responsiveness to that hormone, that master hormone insulin, can be affected. So the body needs more insulin to do what it does to control those blood glucose levels. All of those three lifestyle things, the idea is to make our body as metabolically healthy as possible. So have it operating as it's designed to do. So, insulin doing its job, burning up energy, using up the fuels that we're taking in. So let's look in a bit more detail at each of those. I'm an exercise physiologist, so we're going to talk about exercise first. There's two key types of exercise, if you like, that are important. Aerobic exercise is that, as these people in the picture are doing on the left-hand side slide, the couple out running, that continuous, long, not necessarily slow, but slower intensity exercise, where we do it for a sustained period of time. The belief for a long time was that was the most important sort of exercise, because we burn up more energy typically when we're doing aerobic exercise than we're doing resistance training exercise. That's been proven not to be necessarily the case. Now, we do still need some aerobic exercise. Everybody should be getting some, because it means the tissues become more sensitive to insulin, and it does burn up some of the stored energy that we've got in the muscles. And that then allows the glucose that we take into the blood can go and replace that energy in the muscles. So that's a good thing. What's probably more significant and more helpful is that there's some higher intensity exercise in there. So rather than going out for a continuous walk or a continuous jog or a continuous bike ride at the same pace where it's quite comfortable, we need to vary the pace a little bit, because it's the higher intensity when we go faster that we burn up more of that energy, and more of the muscle fibers, and what we call the fast twitch muscle fibers, so the fibers that are bigger and stronger and faster at contracting, they come into play when we do more higher intensity exercise, and they tend to use up more glucose than the slower twitch fibers, the fibers that are good for slow continuous exercise. So with the aerobic exercise, we need to vary it. We need to do some at a steady pace that's comfortable, but then some of it needs to be at a higher pace. So if you were out for a walk, for example, you'd be walking along at your comfortable pace where you can talk with the person you're with, but for the next block, you might go, as fast as you can or significantly faster. So you're getting puffed. If you're on an exercise bike, it's probably the easiest thing to do. Pedal along comfortably, speed up for a minute and go as fast as you can, slow down. And it's that faster intensity that pulls in more of the muscle fibers, so you're burning up more of the glucose and also stimulating those fibers to take in more glucose out of the blood. So that's the aerobic exercise, so high intensity as well as some low intensity. The gentleman who's having a great time in the pec deck machine on the right-hand side there, doing some resistance exercise training. This is probably the key for diabetics. Not to say the aerobics is not important, but doing some resistance exercise really stimulates those muscles to take in glucose, and it also helps to build muscle. Now, as we get older, we naturally will lose muscle tissue, so we've got less engine, if you like, using up the glucose that we're taking in. Resistance training helps to maintain our muscle mass, and that's the tissue that's the most significant in controlling our blood glucose levels, really, because it's the biggest user of blood glucose. Our brain uses a big percentage, but our muscles, if we're active, uses up the biggest amount. So resistance exercise really is to maintain our muscle mass, but also really stimulate those muscles to take in glucose out of the blood. And it makes those muscles and the cells in the muscles much more sensitive to the effects of insulin, or it can actually opens up the door that insulin, the lock, if you like, that insulin works on without insulin having to do its job. Resistance exercise is, we should do exercise where it's 4 or 5 major exercises that work major muscle groups. something for our legs, but predominantly for our upper body, because that's the exercise. That's the part of our body that doesn't get anywhere near as much exercise as it should. Okay. Just okay. I think I've. Oh yeah, no. Here we go. Okay. So this is a graph of somebody's blood sugar level. I'm going to put this on before I talk about nutrition. So we kind of flick to nutrition, even though the slide about the foods afterwards. This is a typical Australian, American, Western diet, if you like, where people are eating a fair amount of their diet, following the Australian dietary guidelines, is high in carbohydrate, moderate in protein, and low in fat. That's what we've been told for the last 30 or 40 years. And the graph that you can see, the solid line, and that's probably the one to be focused on, is looking at the blood sugar levels during that time. Now, this is somebody on an Australian dietary advice guidelines taking insulin, so somebody who is insulin to manage their blood glucose levels, their diabetes. And you can see that graph jumps up and down depending on what they've eaten and what exercise they've done. We don't need to get into the real details. And they're eating about 250 grams of carbohydrates a day. And remember, carbohydrates are the food that's going to cause our blood glucose levels to change the most. The shaded green area on that graph is where we want people to keep their blood glucose. That's kind of the target range. And you can see for this person, here, this is on this day, it's gone considerably higher, and this is the average glucose. So it's sort of up and down in that range, depending on what they've eaten and what exercise they've done. That's using insulin to manage it, to keep it under control, artificial insulin that's been injected. If we now go to this slide, this is a slide of someone who's reduced their amount of carbohydrate in their diet to less than 50 grams. And you can see that their shaded area is the range they're trying to stay in. And they've done a pretty good job at staying in there. So that gives you a pretty good clue as to what sort of eating is optimal for somebody who's a diabetic, a pre-diabetic, or potentially a diabetic, which is, like I said, all of us really. Optimally, we want to keep our blood glucose levels in that range, and this way of eating. Now clicked on the thing too quick. Let's go back. In this example, is somebody's taking 3 units of insulin, so artificial units, but a third of what they were taking on the previous diet, and not taking any at meal times to manage their blood glucose. If I go back to this one, this is somebody taking 9 units every day and then taking up to 8 to 13 units with their meals to manage their blood glucose levels. So optimally, this is a much better position to be in. What's this diet look like? Let's have a look at the sort of things that you would be eating for if you're diabetic, pre-diabetic, or at risk of diabetes. And this is typically what you would call a lower or reduced carbohydrate diet. Now, the best way of eating for diabetes is one that's not going to put blood glucose to go up. The foods that cause blood glucose levels to go up the most. So we want to eat foods that don't do that. And part of the problem, part of the reason we've got this epidemic of diabetes is that for the last 50 years, since the first American dietary guidelines came in and the Australian dietary guidelines, we've been telling people to avoid fat. And as a consequence, we've been eating more carbohydrates. And what that's done is it's increased the prevalence of diabetes, or significantly contributed to the prevalence of diabetes. Diabetic, low carbohydrate type foods. So your non-starchy vegetables, non-sweet fruit. Now, most fruit's pretty sweet. Typically, we would only eat fruit when it was in season, and that would be for a couple of months of the year. And that would be designed to fatten us up so we would get through winter when there wasn't as much food. With modern transport and modern farming, we get fruit around, so it's easy to continue to store energy away or have too much glucose. So fruit that's not too sweet, and it's probably your berries are your best choices of low sugar fruits. Dairy products, we've encouraged people to eat low fat dairy products, but by default what that's done is it's bumped up the sugar levels in some of those. So we actually encourage people to eat more fat, because fat has no effect on your insulin levels. It won't cause insulin to go up. So all our meats are healthy and have really zero effect on our blood glucose levels. What's happened over the years, because we've been so conscious of avoiding fat, is meat consumption has reduced, and by default we've taken out the meat and the fat that comes with meat and replaced it with carbohydrates, which is why we've got diabetes so high. So a typical diet for diabetes is a meat and vegetable diet, avoiding the starchy vegetables. And there is the evidence about saturated fat in meat that's been completely disproven. So it doesn't affect your cholesterol levels. It doesn't give you heart disease. It's actually healthy and makes us more insulin resistant. We need those fats for ourselves. The other picture I've got on there is the empty plate. And I put that there because fasting has become a good strategy for people managing their blood glucose levels. If you think about it, our blood glucose levels go up when we eat, particularly if we eat high carbohydrate foods. They go down when we don't. So if we can go for extended periods of time or longer periods of time without eating, our blood glucose levels have got the opportunity to get low, which is what we're trying to do to manage our diabetes. What does that look like? Not snacking. So, typically 3 meals a day. And if you're not hungry, not eating. So for a lot of people I work with now who are here to see me about weight loss or diabetes, they're eating 2 meals a day, not because they're not hungry. And if you're eating a meat and vegetable diet and you do this in the right way, you don't get hungry. So it's kind of easy to eat less often if we're not hungry. Hard to do if you're hungry, and carbohydrates will make us hungry, because that's one of insulin's job. It'll make us hungry. So that's kind of the typical way of eating. So we've covered exercise, we've covered food. I talked about sleep, and I'm not going to go into detail about that, but certainly if your sleep is not good, then that's an important thing to try and work on, whether that means changing your sleeping environment, exercising more so you're tireder, making sure you have a good sleep routine. Let's just have a look at the time course of diabetes. So this was a slide looking at the prevalence of diabetes around the world, and I'm looking at particularly at some different factors. So here's the current model is that, it's our diet, we get fat, we get insulin resistance, so the body doesn't work, doesn't respond as well to insulin. Our insulin levels go up, our insulin levels stop working, the cells in the pancreas stop working so well, and then we become type 2 diabetic. Now that's kind of over at this stage if we've gone through that whole process. But let's have a look at how does it change over time from diabetes, pre-diabetes, and even before that. So this light blue line is blood sugar levels, glucose in the blood, glycemia. The green line is insulin that's being secreted by the pancreas. And remember, insulin controls our blood glucose levels. This is our insulin level, this light green line. This dark green line is insulin resistant, so the tissue is not responding as well to insulin. The orange line is body fat levels. So if we go to somebody who is type 2 diabetic, they're often, in a Western world, going to have a lot of adipose tissue, body fat tissue. They're going to be insulin resistant, so the dark green line is going to be high. They're going to have higher and increasing blood glucose levels, but often their insulin levels are starting to go down because their pancreas is kind of worn out. It's done its dash and it can't produce as much, and so the cells in the pancreas stop working so well. If we go back to a pre-diabetic, so their blood glucose levels are still not that high, the insulin levels are starting to come down, but they've been relatively high. They're insulin resistant still, and they're carrying extra body fat. So let's go back right to the start. What happens first? Well, first thing that happens, ignore this little blue sign down here for the moment, but blood glucose levels are normal. So they'll go to the doctor, they'll have a blood test, they'll go, oh no, your blood glucose level's fine. But their insulin levels, this light green one, is starting to go up. That means that to become insulin resistant. So the dark green, the tissues are starting to become resistant to insulin. So the pancreas keeps pumping out more and more and more insulin. Yeah. And as a result of that high insulin, we start to put on weight, start to get fat. That's insulin's job, remember? So if we can identify this early, we can identify who are the people that are likely to be at risk of type 2 diabetes. And what starts this off? What starts this off is putting on weight, too much of a high carbohydrate, and your body's ability or inability to burn fat effectively. So it starts, this little blue box says, this starts with poor fat utilization. Now this overweight range, this pre-diabetes, this can be going on for a decade before somebody's diagnosed with diabetes. And here's the tragedy of all of the people with diabetes today. If we picked it up early, we could prevent all of this from happening by making some of those lifestyle changes, changing their diet, getting them exercise differently, exercising effectively. Yeah. So it starts with the body not being able to burn fat very effectively. That's probably the key thing that goes on. That's the first test. So there's some things in here that we can measure with blood tests, and I'll talk about how do we measure this poor fat oxidation or fat utilization in a second. Just looking at my clock. What are some of the blood tests for diabetes? Typical ones you get a fasting glucose level to know what your blood glucose level's in when you haven't eaten. Optimally, they will be in that 3 to 5.4 kind of range. You can get monitors that monitor that. HbA1c is another test that would be done, which measures the average of your blood glucose over the past three months. A test that isn't often done, but I encourage people to get done, is a fasting insulin level. Now, insulin is the hormone that controls blood glucose. It's not a routinely done test, but it's the one that will pick up early. So you might have normal blood glucose levels. If I just go back on, you might have normal blood glucose levels down here, but your insulin's starting to go up. And that tells you that you're on the way to diabetes before your blood glucose gets high. If you wait for this to get high, it could be 10 years before you get picked up as a diabetic. You go back to those blood tests. What else is important? With that insulin and glucose, we can measure insulin resistance. So if your blood glucose level is normal, but your insulin's very high, it means the pancreas is working very hard to keep you from becoming diabetic. What else is a good blood test or important blood test? Vitamin D. I'm amazed at the number of people who are vitamin D deficient. And if your vitamin D is low, the pancreatic cells don't work as well to produce, to make the insulin, and that's what we need. So there's some blood tests, but I talked about fat oxidation in that last slide. If I just go back here again, I talked about it starts with poor fat utilization. How do we measure that? Up until not that long ago, the last 4 or 5 years probably, or a bit longer, the only organisations or only places that had the capacity to measure fat oxidation, fat utilisation, were universities and hospitals. Fortunately, I've been working with a company here in WA that's developed this little device. It's called an ECAL device. It measures the oxygen and carbon dioxide that you're either using or producing, the oxygen that you're using and the carbon dioxide that you're producing. And this is what a test looks like. A friend of mine, sitting on the table in my office here doing it, breathing. So they breathe through this little mouthpiece. This mouthpiece is connected up to this little device. It measures oxygen and carbon dioxide. And we can calculate from that how much fat the body's burning and how much glucose the body's burning. If in fact it is burning any fat, or if it's just relying on glucose. And typically for diabetics, they rely solely on glucose for their energy because high insulin stops the body from burning fat. So we can identify early if somebody's at risk of becoming diabetic or pre-diabetic by doing this test. The test takes about 10 minutes. And there's some other tests that help, and those blood tests help. So this is just another tool to help identify people who are at risk. I've been talking for a long time. I'm going to unmute people. If people want to find out if they're at risk, obviously there's those tests. They could talk to their doctor about those blood tests to see if they are diabetic or on the path to diabetes. I obviously can do those fat oxidation tests here.